days ago, I posted a video setting up 2 new leopard gecko enclosures. A lot of you guys enjoyed this video, however, there were a lot of questions / concerns that I saw down in the comments, and just some things that I think I didn't really talk about in that video that I probably should have. So now I'm kind of just coming back with a bit of an update to give you guys a bit more information and also to answer all of your questions and concerns that I saw. So I'm pretty sure the biggest question / concern that I saw in the comments were people asking me about the risk of impaction because I was using a loose substrate and also a substrate that happens to resemble sand. And now a lot of people, if you own a leopard gecko or reptiles in general, you've probably heard of the term impaction before. So let's go ahead and talk about that. So the substrate that I chose to use was the Exoterra Stone Desert substrate. I used the color Sonoran Ochre. So this substrate, when it comes to just kind of the overall look of it, the color and the texture of it, it does very much resemble sand. However, this substrate is actually very, very, very different from sand, so they're not really comparable. I'm sure most of us know, sand is made up of tiny little stones, tiny, tiny, tiny little grains of old rocks. That is what sand is. So sand is basically tiny, tiny rocks. This Exoterra Stone Desert substrate is not sand at all. It is more of a dirt clay material. So yeah, just right off the bat, they are quite different. So now let's talk about impaction and the risk of impaction. So impaction is what happened when an animal ingests something and isn't able to pass it through their digestive tract. And this can result in blockages and obstructions and all sorts of not good problems. Impaction is often a fear of a lot of people when it comes to using loose substrates, as they're worried that their leopard gecko, for example, is going to eat the substrate and not be able to pass it through. So while impaction is a serious issue, there are a lot of misconceptions out there about it. So despite what you hear, impaction is not caused by loose substrate alone. There are a lot of factors that play into it, and loose substrate, when used properly, is perfectly safe for animals like leopard geckos. The first thing we have to think about is the fact that these animals are a lot more intelligent than we are giving them credit for. Your gecko, I can guarantee you, knows the difference between food and dirt. If your animal happens to take in a mouthful of substrate, they are more likely than not just going to spit it out. I have observed it in so many different of my animals. Anytime they get substrate in their mouth, they spit it out on their own and don't need any assistance. These animals are more intelligent than we give them credit for. Now, what happens if your animal does ingest substrate? Because it does happen. Even if your animal spits it out, there's often a few little pieces that they miss. Sometimes it can just come in with their food. So what happens if they do ingest the substrate? Well, assuming you are using a safe substrate and your care is correct, it's going to pass through them no issue at all. Impaction happens when we are using unsafe substrates and not caring for the animal properly. So an example of an unsafe substrate would be something like calcium sand or vitamin sand, any of those products. Those are not a natural product, they have added dyes and colors into them a lot of the time, and the fact that they have calcium or vitamins in the sand can actually encourage your animal to eat it, and the calcium that's mixed in with the sand has clumping properties, so if ingested it can sometimes clump up inside your animal, and obviously that causes issues. So using unsafe substrate options can lead to impaction, but as long as you are using something safe, this is much less of a risk. So this Exoterra Stone Desert substrate, for example, is a 100% natural product, and the risk of impaction with this is very minimal. We will talk about this in a little bit more detail soon. Impaction can also occur when your care is incorrect. So you could even be keeping your animal on a safe substrate option, but if your care isn't right, this could also lead to issues like impaction. Heat is incredibly important when it comes to a reptile's ability to digest things and, you know, overall just have a functioning digestive tract. Without proper temperatures, your animal's digestive function is going to be compromised. So issues like this, again, can lead to impaction. So if your temperatures aren't warm enough and your animal is not able to digest things properly, this is when an issue like impaction can arise. However, assuming that you're using a safe substrate option and that your temperatures and your diet and everything is all correct, the risk of impaction is quite low, and the pros that loose substrate brings, in my opinion, outweigh the cons. Now, it does come down to personal preference. If you prefer loose substrate, that is your choice, that is fine. I, however, just prefer loose substrate, and that is just my personal choice. So another concern that I saw was people worried that this Exoterra stone desert substrate would possibly clump inside of an animal, the same way I explained something like calcium sand would. And now this is definitely a valid concern. All of the questions and concerns people brought to me were very valid. However, it is not something you have to worry about. So I explained how calcium sand, when ingested, can clump up and, cause blockages or obstructions and things like that. The reason for this is because the calcium sand and just whatever's in it clumps together when it's wet. So calcium sand, when it's dry, it is a completely just loose powder. However, when it's wet, it starts to clump together. So if your animal eats it and their saliva and just digestive juices get into it, this can cause it to clump up. The Exoterra stone desert substrate, however, is basically the complete opposite of that. So yes, this material does harden and clump, but it needs to be dry. So if your animal happens to eat some of this, it's not going to harden inside of them because it needs to be exposed to air. So in order for the Exoterra stone desert substrate to harden, it needs to be wet, exposed to air, allowed to dry out, and then it's going to be dry and solid and clumped together. However, if the substrate gets ingested and comes in contact with your animal's saliva and digestive juices, it's basically going to do the opposite of what calcium sand would do, and it's basically just going to fall apart and crumble. I'll show a quick little video here of what happens to it when it's wet. So yeah, this is basically the opposite of calcium sand. Calcium sand clumps when wet. This stuff, when wet, just falls apart. So again, assuming your care is correct, if this substrate happens to get ingested, it should pass through your animal, no problem. So hopefully that clears things up for those of you who are worried about the possible impaction risk. Well, I don't want to say it is never going to happen. As long as you are taking proper care of your animal, the risk of impaction is very minimal. So now let's talk about the actual enclosures themselves, because I did have a few comments on these as well. I did have a few comments of people telling me that, maybe I should add a few more plants or a few more hiding spots and things like that, and I want to say I hear you and I fully agree with you. So this is something I probably should have talked about a bit more in my last video, but these enclosures are not fully done yet. So they're finished for now. The bulk of the enclosure is done, but there are still a few more finishing touches that I need to do before I put my geckos in. So my geckos aren't living in the enclosures yet. Like I said in my last video, I'm still waiting for some new heating equipment to arrive. So once I get my new heating equipment and I'm setting these enclosures up for my geckos, I'm going to be making a few changes to them. So for example, I'm going to be adding some things like sphagnum moss to create some humid areas. I'll probably add a few more different hiding spots, and I think I'm going to be adding some more plants into them as well. So I did just kind of want to give that update. Yeah, I feel like I just didn't really mention in my last video that these enclosures aren't entirely done yet, so I do still have some more finishing touches to add to them. So you guys will see that in a video that should be coming out sometime soon. And now the last thing I wanted to talk about was cleaning, because I did have a lot of people ask me how I'm going to clean these enclosures, are they going to be gross and all this stuff. So let's talk about that. I can very much see why these enclosures look like they would be difficult difficult to clean. However, I can promise you that it is a lot more simple than it may look. So the majority of the substrate in these enclosures is just, you know, loose substrate. So I can clean this out the same way you would clean any other loose substrate out. You know, you just scoop it out and throw the dirty stuff away. Now for the substrate that is actually, you know, hardened onto the structures, obviously that would be a little bit more difficult to clean. So the benefit to leopard geckos is they tend to use the bathroom in the same spot. So I'm not too worried about my leopard geckos, you know, just like pooping all over the enclosure. I doubt that's going to happen. They're most likely going to choose one corner to use the bathroom in. However, that doesn't mean I don't need to clean the whole enclosure, so let's talk about that. For the substrate that's actually hardened, it's a lot easier to replace than you may think. It crumbles away incredibly easy. If there's a spot that I need to take away, it's extremely easy to just pull that spot off and then I can put some more substrate back on. So no worries, I do know how to clean this enclosure. I don't think I'll have any problem keeping it clean for my geckos, so yeah, I did just want to talk about that. While it does look really complicated to clean, it really isn't that difficult. Okay, so I am just going to go ahead and end the video here. I don't know if you guys cared about this at all, but for those of you who, you know, did have questions and concerns, I do hope that this cleared some of them up for you and hopefully you have a better idea of what is going on now. You know, I always take people's concerns and questions into consideration, you know, I never brush them off and stuff, so I do appreciate everyone who left me questions and concerns, and yeah, hope this cleared them up for you. With all this said, I'm just going to go ahead and end this video now. Thank you all so much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy this video, please be sure to give it a big thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Also be sure to check out all of my social media. That will all just be down in the description below. I would love to have you guys over there, so don't forget to check that out. With all of this said, I'm gonna go ahead and end the video now. Thank you all so much for watching and I will see you all in my next video.